Hey there, everybody. This is National Master Dane Matson, and I just released my 0 to 600 beginner study guide. I have the link included in the description below, so be sure to check out the study guide there on chess.com. And one big thing, helping people with their improvement goals in 2025. So excited to do it. I spent quite a bit of time talking about, as you take your first steps, to focus on playing beginner bots. So today I thought I would share maybe a few games where I'm playing against Martin, just to give some examples of, what we might face on the 64 squares and how we can rage against the machine and score a point for humanity, maybe even 3 points. I think I'm going to do 3 video examples of playing against Martin, because in my study guide, I do recommend try to beat each bot 3 times. Okay, so Martin is rated 250, and he's our first beginner bot, and apparently his 4-year-old son just beat him. Ouch. Well, let's see if we can provide more learning opportunities for Martin here. So let's go. Okay, if you've looked at my article referenced within the article, the Win Your First Game Against a Bot, we talk a lot about controlling the center. We talk a lot about activating our pieces and castling. So keep that in mind. I'm going to start out with e4. That's a really useful move, says Martin. Okay, he responds in kind. E5, claiming his fair share of the center here. And if I play d4, well, maybe he's going to take my pawn. So how about I develop a piece and ask a question? Are you going to defend that pawn, Martin? What should I do? Well, you should defend the pawn. And just like in my bot article, I mentioned this move is often associated with just winning a pawn, knight f3, because black is just making a normal developing move, but isn't paying attention to what I would play next. Now, before I capture this pawn, I always want to look and say, okay, what is my opponent up to here? What would they play next? They are attacking f2, so I need to be careful. Capturing a pawn, which would check my king, but hey, my king is guarding the bishop, or excuse me, guarding the pawn that the bishop is attacking. So we have one defender against one attacker. And if my opponent wants to give up a 3-point piece for a pawn, no problem. Happy to do it. So I'm going to take the pawn. Queen f6. Tricky, tricky, tricky. So Martin is attacking the knight. And where I have to be a little bit careful here is we can kind of zoom into a square and say, okay, my knight is attacked. Maybe I'll move my knight somewhere. Well, that is going to be probably a good idea, but before you figure out where you should move or, what the point is behind the move, let's zoom out a little bit. The knight is being attacked, but basically every time your opponent makes a move, right, the queen comes out. I want to look at the new squares or pieces that this queen controls. And what I mean by pieces is the queen is attacking my knight. And also, look at that, the queen is attacking f2. Now, before, I wasn't so worried about one attacker and one defender. But now, black has a bishop and a queen attacking f2, which means my king is the only defender. So if I'm not careful, queen f2 is going to be checkmate on the very next move. So what I'm going to play is, I like the move d4, truth be told, to attack the bishop, defend my knight, and block the checkmating attack. But let's just say, hey, you're playing your first game against a bot. You see what the threat is. It's a double attack. My knight's being attacked. f2 is also being attacked. Let's just move our knight back. Okay, knight h6. The knight is on the edge of the board. I don't love that move. And notice that's the consequence of going for that quick checkmate. The queen felt good on this square for one move, but now she's kind of in the way of the other pieces. So knight h6. I don't see any landing squares. I always look out for where the knight may leap next. I don't see a threat. And I have one, and behind that pawn, 2 supporters of d4. So let's get this pawn rolling. Tempo move, threatening to win the bishop. Okay, this happens all the time. Whether provoked or just on the first move, the bishop comes out and attacks the king. In the article, we talk about king CPR. Oftentimes we think of R, run with the king. We could move up the board, but we don't want to do that. We lose the right to castle. We get in the way of this bishop here. Not a good plan. I want to think about king CPR. So R is run, that's the last one. C is capture the checking piece. Any way I can capture the bishop. Unfortunately, not yet. Okay, what about P? Protect or block my king from the check. Well, I see no shortage of ways to block, that is to put a piece between the attacking bishop and our king. Could throw the knight here too. But let's clear all that noise. Pawns are not pieces. Remember that. Pawns are worth 1, and bishops and knights are minor pieces. They're worth 3. Rooks are worth 5, and queens are worth 9. Pawns are not pieces. So when a bishop is speeding or racing down the diagonal, attacking our king, think of a pawn as like a stop sign, stopping this bishop in its tracks. I think the best move here is to combine defense with attack. So our king is under attack. Let's defend our king and attack the bishop at the same time. Okay, Martin retreats. Very good. His kids send their greetings, apparently, according to the chat there. These bots are really fun. Okay, so new move, new piece. I could attack the queen. Pawns are not pieces. But before I start rushing with that attack, why don't I just make kind of a simple developmental plan? I want a castle, right? So the bishop needs to be active. I probably would move it to d3, but for the sake of this video, let's get a little more aggressive. Let's control the center and point toward the king side. And now, the queen is attacking the pawn and g2. That's why I mentioned earlier I had a slight preference to bishop d3, but the sky is by no means falling. Martin's playing pretty well. And so I look at the new moves, right? What is the queen attacking? e4 with check, by the way, and g2. Okay, so double attack. I'm forked. What can I do about it? Well, I could play queen e2, but then the queen could take the pawn and threaten the rook. And okay, maybe I could play rook g1, but we're getting a little deep here, right? Sometimes you have to figure out what matters most. I want to get my king castled to safety. And so one thing I'd like to do is not allow this pawn to get captured with check. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to castle. And if he takes the pawn, I'm going to play rook e1. Well, welcome to the world of bots. The queen sacrificed itself. Okay, well, there's only one legal move. Nothing to really say here. Just to kind of point something out, by the way, is if the queen captured the pawn, yes, I lose a pawn, but I also open up a line. So I could play rook e1, attack the queen, and through that queen, I'm aligned with the bishop, and behind that bishop is the king. So although I might be down a pawn, I'm going to get really active pieces. I have a huge lead in development. But okay, Martin decides to go for broke, maybe doing a little checkmate dance, thinking it's over. But king CPR. Can I capture the checking piece? You bet. Nothing's protecting it. Let's go. Okay, centralizing the knight. Not a bad move. Let's just develop another piece. Bishop f4. Didn't see any threat with that knight, by the way. So Martin castles. Okay. Now, earlier, remember I talked about the queen capturing the pawn. And so you lose a pawn, but I made the point that it opens up lines for our pieces. Well, although I won a queen for a pawn, which feels great, my king's, a little area there, not feeling perfectly safe. And now that there isn't a pawn on the g file, right? I should say a white pawn. Our rook might be really happy to use that file and start creating some pressure against the king. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move my king to h1, hiding behind a pawn and opening up my rook. So I'm already seeing a possibility here is if I play rook g1, that's going to pin the pawn to the king. And so what that means is if I ever captured this knight with my rook on g1, the pawn would be unable to capture because then it would expose the king to a check there. And so Martin has retreated the bishop. New move, new piece. Remember that. Wasting time with development. Not clear what the bishop is doing there. I don't see any new threats, right, from the bishop. And so therefore, I'm going to play rook g1. Okay. Now, the knight is attacking our bishop. It turns out, I think a really good move here is bishop takes knight, highlighting the pin. But let's practice like we're playing, against a bot yourself or another human opponent on chess.com. And when your opponent plays a move like knight f5, you always want to ask, what is the threat? So even though I have a good plan here, I see a good tactic, In an actual game, when your opponent plays knight a5, you might panic a little bit and say, hey, my bishop's loose. And the more you think that way, which is what would my opponent play next? Well, they want to take the bishop. But if they are unable to take the bishop, look at the knight. It's kind of just looking at the edge of the board, ready to kind of jump off the cliff there. It doesn't have a lot of potential. So I want to avoid losing the bishop. And I don't even want to trade my knight for a bishop, meaning I could play like queen e2 or knight bd2 or something to guard the bishop. But hey, that knight, its potential is off the board. A knight on the rim is dim or grim. And so I'm going to step away. My bishop is safe. This knight looks kind of silly. Okay, so just to kind of point something out, Martin played knight g4. My next move would have been bishop takes knight. That was my plan, because then the pawn could not capture my bishop because that would expose the king to my rook. So therefore the pawn was pinned. This was my plan. And instead, Martin leaps forward. Now, really good example here. Rather than focusing on what should I play next, give your opponent an extra move. Knights are really tricky. When they jump, they create chaos all over the board. Look at those squares. And anytime a knight moves, I want to ask, where is it going to land? Am I worried about these squares? No, not really. No. What about things this knight can capture? Well, it could capture this pawn, but I have 1, 2, 3 defenders doing pretty well. So therefore, the only move that really worries me is knight takes f2. There's nothing guarding that pawn, so it's hanging or loose. And notice it's in forking distance of the knight, meaning the knight would then fork our queen and king. Check the king, attack our queen. Now, thankfully, when I kind of say, look at all the new captures, it goes both ways. I looked at all black's captures. Now I want to ask, do I have any new captures now that the knight's here? And sure enough, look at that. The rook went on the g file to go bowling, knock over some pins. Well, hey, let's take this knight. Okay. Why did my opponent play that move? Always be careful with pawn moves because they move in a different direction than how they capture. Pawns capture diagonally. I once heard it as the pawn is holding a shield in front of it because it's usually on the front lines of battle. So it kind of has to diagonally attack because the shield is in its way. So my rook is attacked. No problem. Just go back home. Rook g1. Okay, f6. The forget about it pawn. Forget about moving it. The king is now exposed, so I would look at my most forcing moves. I see a check there, but then I would lose my queen. Check there, lose my bishop, okay? Does the move threaten anything? No, not really. So what should we do here? Well, I could play bishop h6, and why don't we kind of point that out just to demonstrate the idea of a pin. Notice my bishop cannot be captured because that would expose the king to check. So this is not a move, cannot take my bishop because then the king would be in check. Okay, I have 2 attackers. Rook takes g7 check is a great move. Really like that move. But on the other hand, after knight c4, where is the knight landing? b2 could take a pawn. And hey, it's not defending anything. Or it's not defended, I should say. So my pawn is hanging. So that's one new capture. Is there another new capture? Aha, a capture for us. So we can capture the knight with check. So 2 attackers versus 1 on g7. I think this move is excellent. But let's just make a point of taking the knight with check. Okay, now he blocks the check with the rook. Now, this would be an example of king CPR, or maybe you should have moved your king away, but that shouldn't be our first reaction. And now we're noticing 2 interesting things. The rook is pinned to its own king, meaning it can't move anywhere because it would expose its king to my bishop. And this pawn is also pinned, unable to capture our bishop here because then the king would be exposed. So a bishop is worth 3, a rook is worth 5, so this would be a favorable trade. But hang on a minute. If the rook is pinned, it's unable to move to any of these squares. So although it looks like it's defending the pawn, it isn't because it's currently pinned by my bishop. So that means I have 2 attackers, and because this rook is pinned, there's only 1 defender. So rather than immediately capturing the rook, let's bring our rook into the game here and take. Okay, king moves to the corner. Again, if we go back, just to summarize, the rook cannot capture the rook. See that flashing red there? Because it would have been exposing its king to an attack, and you can't allow your opponent to capture your king. So now, after the king crouches in the corner, I am now going to take advantage of inviting another piece to the party. We have a rook, we have a bishop. Let's bring our other bishop into the party. Think carefully. We might have checkmate soon. Okay, thanks, Martin. Appreciate your encouragement. So let's see here. I have a bishop and a rook all working together. If I play check, the king could then take advantage of the space my rook left behind. So maybe I can invite another piece to the party. The king has a grand whopping total of 0 squares, right? Can't capture our rook because of the bishop here. Can't move here. Rook guards that square. Can't move here. Rook and bishop. Okay. So I need to invite another piece to the party. When your opponent's king has 1 or 0 safe squares, as is the case here, it can't move at all, we should sort of have some alarm bells ringing, like checkmate alert, checkmate alert. I need to invite one more piece to the party. What if I could just kind of go backwards? If I could move any piece I wanted, like just picked it up, place it anywhere. If the queen could move here or here, that would be checkmate. And you can kind of work backwards and be like, well, how would I get to that square? Well, I could go here, here, and okay, like that. But that takes a number of moves, right? 1, 2, 3 moves. Okay, what if I could move this knight here? That would be checkmate. King can't move, and you can't block a check from above. Okay, how do I get to that square? Well, I could go to e5 and f3, right? But if I do that, always ask yourself before you commit to a move, is that a safe square? Is anything protecting it? Notice the pawn there could capture my knight. Okay, so I don't want to move here because then I would lose my knight. How else can I hop to that mating square? How about h4? The bishop is lined up on that diagonal, but if I move the knight here, thankfully its own pawn is in the way. It can't capture our knight. So it looks like by working backwards, we created our dream scenario. I want to move the knight here. We work backwards. Now we know how to turn our dream into a reality. Knight h4, b6, okay? And now the dream comes true. Checkmate. So pretty instructive game against Martin. If we go back, just to kind of highlight, I played a typical opening move. New move, new piece. I developed the knight. I put pressure on the pawn. My opponent should have played something like knight c6 to guard the pawn. Instead, they played bishop c5. I did note that the bishop is attacking my pawn there. And even though it doesn't matter now, being aware of that threat or potential threat helped us a lot on the very next move, right? So here we're like, okay, one defender versus one attacker, we're doing okay. But once I captured that pawn and Martin played queen f6, we have to focus on not just our knight hanging, but all of the new captures. And because now there's a second attacker and I only still have one defender, my king, if I'm not careful and play some, random pawn move or something, this is going to be checkmate because I can't take the queen thanks to the bishop defending the queen there. So therefore, by thinking about what my opponent would play next and thought about all of the new captures, I moved back. I played d4, planted a second flag in the mountain. And then after bishop b4 check, we thought about king CPR, right? R is run. Make that your last choice. Sometimes it's good, but usually there's a better way to deal with a check. I wasn't able to capture the checking piece, so I played c3, right? Like that. Martin moved his bishop back to his credit. Didn't allow me to win the bishop for free. And I mentioned my intuition was bishop d3 here, but instead I played bishop c4 because that's a typical developing move. It controls the center, points toward the f7 pawn, which can be a weakness since the king is right there. And to Martin's credit, he found a really tricky move. He created a double attack, and I decided, since I couldn't clearly defend both pawns that are under attack, I decided to prioritize what matters most, king's safety castle early and often. So I got out of the center by castling. And this is where I mentioned if Martin would have captured the pawn, I would have then played rook e1 to attack the queen and do a little bit of bowling down the e-file. Instead, he sacrificed his queen, and things really went downhill from there. The other big tactical point I want to point out here is the idea of a pin. Look at how many times we used a pin. I played rook g1, pinning the pawn to its king. And after the knight moved to a5, we always want to think about what my opponent would play next, look at the new captures, if any. I stepped away, allowing that knight to kind of rot on the edge of the board. And after the knight moved here, I was really worried about the fork, and I looked at every new capture. First for the opponent, the knight has two things it can capture, both of these pawns. And then I asked, do I have a new capture? And sure enough, there's a free knight right there. And so the rest of the game kind of went downhill for Martin. Just brought my rook back, and after black moved the, what's that pawn called again? Sorry, I forget about it. Oh yeah, the forget about it pawn, the F pawn. Forget about moving it. Just a waste of time. Martin's rook and bishop are just sleeping there, not allowing all of the pieces to get into the game. Well, I decided to attack this pin pawn, put pressure on the pin pawn. Now we have a bishop and a rook, two attackers and only one defender, the king. And after knight c4, I could have continued with my plan. I really like rook takes pawn check there, but I just kind of want to emphasize, look for the free stuff. The knight moved here. Why? He's threatening a pawn, which would then fork our bishop and queen. But are there other captures? Aha, a free capture. So that's why I emphasize taking here first. And then the rook pinned itself to the king to block the check. And in so doing, we were able to find this fancy move. Rook takes pawn was not, or rook takes a rook was not possible because of the pin, and therefore the king crouched in the corner. We happily collected the free gift. And then hopefully the other big lesson here is when a king has 1 or 0 safe squares, no legal moves here available for the king, that's a big sign to look for a tactic. And I had 3 pieces versus the lone king. All 3 pieces are working together. Meanwhile, black's pieces are looking pretty sluggish, just slumbering on the back rank. And so I thought, well, how do I invite another piece to the party? Get the knight there. How do I safely get there? Not e5 because of the pawn, but instead h4. And there's no way to stop my next move. And that is our first win against a beginner bot, Martin. I'll record 2 more videos to share how I played against Martin, just so you have some good examples. And along the way, we're going to learn quite a bit about the game. So this is my first video focusing on our Improvers Club. So if you're not a member of our Improvers Club, or if you haven't signed up for the 2025 chess.com Chess Improvement Challenge, I have links below. Be sure to join us there. And if you have any questions, it's quite possible I'll record a video answering some of your questions, in addition to just, making comments in the forum as well. So thank you again for hanging out with me. Hope you had a great session here, and I look forward to hearing from you. And I'll see you next time.